Hey everyone, it's Ivan with KitBadger.com, here to tell you about this little knife. The story actually starts back in 2018. Chad from CK Knife and Tool reached out to me and he said, hey, I like your channel, I like your content. Would you be interested in doing a collaboration knife with me? It's a custom knife maker. I was like, that would be really cool. I looked at his stuff, has some really cool designs, really well done stuff, and I was like, let's do this, that'd be fun. But then it opened up the whole, what kind of knife do I want to make? One, I really appreciate knives on the front of utility as well as potential self-defense. But as far as my practical application, like use, like continued use through the years, time spent with a knife, largely a Mora. They're amazing knives. I don't think you can get a better knife for the price. Like $10 at our local kind of farm store. Almost indestructible, razor sharp. I've gutted, skinned out elk with them. I think they're great. But with that in mind, like what do I want out of a knife? So kind of from a starting point of a Mora, if I was gonna design a knife, what would I kind of tweak and change? I started the journey initially with these, sketching out kind of a couple different blade designs as well as handles, and cutting them out, trying to get a feel for what I would want with respect to how big a handle was going to be, how big a knife was going to be, and kind of playing around with the concept, again, starting point of a Mora, but what did I want out of the knife? Going back to the idea of utility, as well as something that could basically be used in a defensive role. And while those honestly are kind of on opposite ends of the knife spectrum, and then way off in a totally different direction, you just have stuff that people think is cool, which doesn't really fall into either of those categories. But I was like, how do I basically incorporate the features I'm looking for into this knife? As I started looking at the Moras and what I liked about them, I kind of drew a few things from it. One, the handle shape. The handle shape generally pretty rounded and it's comfortable. To the end of, it's not giant scallops out of micarta that look really cool, especially on Instagram, till you try and process wood and then you just have blisters all through your hand. Or the blade. The blade's actually relatively thin. And to that end, it actually cuts really well on those Moras, in part due to the grind, with the Scandi grind they use. And so kind of starting there, I started looking at, okay, well, what would I want different from this? So to the end of something that would potentially use defensively, that's kind of where those giant scallops in some of those handles are. Because no, you're not processing firewood. So if I wanted something that was going to stay in my hand without compromising its ability to go do backcountry tasks, how would I accomplish that? And be like, well, actually kind of a deep rounded handle to include a lot more coming out this way so that once you grab it, it pretty much just sinks into your hand and you're not going to end up letting go of it. So I was like, all right, that is important. And to the end of defensive role, some sort of point that actually comes out and spatially, when you're holding this thing, you know where that point is in relation to your hand, the blade. And so those things became really important. So how do I kind of combine those together? Over a couple weeks, I ended up brainstorming and kind of coming up with a list of ideas, some of which I ended up bouncing off my buddy Matt over at Jerking the Trigger. And finally I was like, I think this is kind of more or less what I'm looking for. And I ended up sending an email to Chad. Said, hey Chad, here's some of my thoughts on the knife in no particular order. One, S35 VN steel for field durability. And where I landed on with that is, while everything is a trade-off, like you get something really hard, it becomes brittle, maybe something is more resistant to rust, now it's harder to sharpen, this, that. I ended up absolutely kind of siding with respect to steel choice on something that was going to be harder and also less resistant, less prone to rust. Because when I'm out doing things, maintaining my knife probably is not one of them. I'm terrible about maintenance, and I didn't want to get back from the field and just have something that was just covered in scales of rust. So started off right there. 2, tapered tang with lightning cuts to keep the weight down, which is something actually really cool that CK Knife and Tool does. The tang is tapered, which is awesome. It lightens the whole knife. And then on top of that, actually lightening cuts through there under the scales to, again, keep it down. This is something that's gonna be carried. Don't really want a boat anchor or, yeah, I don't want to carry a pry bar around. So on top of that, speaking to a pry bar, 1/8 inch blade for weight and cutting ability. I want something usable. I've seen some great knives, bought some great knives. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. And honestly, it's a better pry bar than a knife. If I want a knife, I want it to be able to cut. And 1/8 inch thick blade stock definitely helps to that end. Number 4, flat micarta handles for grip and functionality. Stuff's good. As it wears, it almost becomes smooth, but at the same time kind of sticky to the hand, which doesn't make sense, but is the way. 5, acid wash blade, just something kind of flat. 6, 2 3/4 to 4/5 flat grind. So something higher rather than shorter. Again, going back to being able to have a nice cutting ability on the blade. 7, swedge to the clip point for strength at the point. This was something that kind of got kicked around, and going back to the idea of using something defensively, being able to pierce and thrust. Point's important, but depending on basically blade angles, you can end up with a really weak point that'll end up breaking on you. Don't want that. 8, point of the blade in line with the middle of the knife. Handle dimensions included. Exactly what I was talking about as far as spatially. If you're holding the knife, the point of the blade is going to be center line. So it's coming straight out the middle of your hand. Makes it really easy with respect to just spatial awareness, knowing where the point of that knife is. In addition to that, 9, choil for easier blade sharpening. If you're unfamiliar, I'm not a knife expert by any stretch of the imagination, but basically that little cutout right at the end of the blade towards the handle that makes it easier ultimately for maintaining your blade. 10, 3 to 3 1/4 inch blade cutting edge. Utility. I love Morris. I also want something that I'm gonna be carrying. Sometimes probably just somewhere centerline basically. I don't want a long blade. When I look at practical application for knives, honestly, it's not huge. Like relatively small blades will take care of almost every task you come across. 11, 3 3/4 to 4 inch handle, actual gripping surface. Again, I don't need some giant like 1.5-hand sword. That's not what this is. Just something small enough to where it'll fill the hand and pretty much nothing extra. And then lastly, number 12, flat pommel / butt of the knife to place the thumb over for reverse grip and whatnot. Essentially, having something flat there that you could either put your thumb across or put the heel of your hand across to drive if you need even more pressure. That was kind of the criteria I gave them and the starting point for making a blade. Talking with Chad, we figured the best place to start would probably be some prototypes. Rather than going through and creating a really expensive knife and slowly chipping away at it, sending it back and forth, he's like, hey, why don't I make some prototypes out of mild steel, just some wood handles, and we'll start there. I was like, sounds good. So he ended up sending out 3. This was one of them. And honestly, of the 3 he sent me, this is probably the one, if I saw it in the store, I was out on a backpacking trip and I forgot a knife and needed to buy a knife, I'd probably buy this. Like, it's a nice looking knife. It is also basically his knife. Almost all of his knives really share a lot of the same design features in this. And while it kind of put together some of the stuff I was looking for, definitely that really high flat grind. Once you get out towards the point, as you can see, it gets really thin. So the point isn't as strong. Also, we ended up sending out this little guy right here. And this one, definitely closer to what I was looking for. Grind not quite as high as I was liking, and the point not as much, but definitely more so than the other one, stronger. Again though, that point still isn't really center line with the middle of the handle, which is what I was looking for. Mind you, all three of these are tapered tang, which is pretty cool. But the third one is probably closest, and it was this right here. And still, there were a couple little nuances, but this was getting pretty close to what I was looking for as far as blade design and everything like that. Again, when you look at it, you're like, what? But no, when it comes down to the utility that I'm looking for, this was kind of what I ended up settling on, which ultimately turned into this. This is where I ended up landing. Admittedly, the blade, kind of unconventional, but I'm basically taking two sides of the spectrum and trying to meet in the middle. I do really like the fact that the point is center line with the handle. When you hold this spatially, you know where that point is, and that is what I was going for. Additionally, because of the grind and the way the blade is made, you actually have a really strong point as far as thickness, but at the same time, it's delicate enough for, say, catch a trout, being able to jab it in, slice it up, and gut trout. Really handy. Our blade still has enough of a belly for if you need to skin something out. Really, really important for utility. And here we have a tapered tang. That makes it much lighter than it would otherwise be. The way the handle is made, really, really comfortable. The handle pretty much just fits, at least for my hand, sinks in there, it doesn't move. And when you go back to the idea of a, hate to use the word, but like a fighting knife, what's important? Well, not dropping your knife for one. To that end, without having big, giant, egregious gouges in the micarta to make this to where you won't slip out of your hands, it's actually shaped in a way where you won't lose it. Basically, it's cut in here, cut in there, as well as up here and up here. With that, it does not move once it's in your hand. And additionally, this being flat back there, if you grab this reverse grip and put your thumb over it, or if you need palm of your other hand, anything you need to do. All together, again, built trying to find that balance with respect to utility as well as potentially fighting knife. And all of it too with a straight spine, which ties back into that utility. What are some of the tasks I want to be able to accomplish with my knife? Well, obviously fire making, to include being able to baton wood, where we take something largely bigger than we would otherwise be able to process with a pretty small knife and be able to get more manageable pieces that we can then use to end up building our fire. And this definitely lends itself to that. Able to take stuff that, yeah, would not be working if we did not have a knife, and split this stuff apart, get it to where it's usable for our fire. In addition to that, what about more delicate stuff? If we want to come in and start shaving things, whether it's trying to make a feather stick or maybe shave some different fat wood. Chad and I, we did not sacrifice blade design to turn this into some sort of ridiculous pry bar. Like, you can come in here and get really, really delicate and do that with this. I wanted that utility built into it. While batoning may seem kind of mundane, depending on where you are, and especially the climate, it is arguably one of the only ways to get dry wood, especially when it's really wet out. And that is why this is actually really important in my knife design. Another important aspect I'd mentioned earlier is 90-degree spine for using this knife with a ferro rod to start fires. What are other aspects of utility I'm looking for in a knife? Well, aside from being able to start fires, what are other things I want to do? One, be able to skin out game, whether it's big game or small game. While I actually haven't skinned out big game with this, I've actually skinned out 2 rabbits with it. I think arguably if something will skin a rabbit out, it will most certainly skin out a elk or pretty much anything at that point. And this definitely lends itself to that. The blade design, going back to it, it's thin enough to where it'll cut, and there's enough of a belly that it does a good job of removing skin from the meat, being able to just kind of almost like fleshing. And to that end, really pleased with the performance of this knife. For me personally, this blade, as far as length also, really handy. It's the sweet spot. Being able to index the tip while still holding the handle, especially important in gutting, especially big game. Reaching into a cavity, not being able to see your hand or the blade, but being able to know in space where that point is. Definitely important. Have I gotten in any knife fights? No, and hopefully I never will. Will this lend itself to that? I think it will, based on the training I've done with Bill Rapier, as well as others. This, while not a fighting knife, can lend itself to that. Being able to grab on this and it's not going to come out of your hand, whether you're holding it here or in a reverse grip, and being able to thumb over the back, have even more power, or heel over the top of this if you really need to penetrate. But we go back to the utility. What is this really designed around? Well, it's definitely designed around that utility side with the ability to be used kind of over on that other end of the spectrum as well. One thing I haven't touched on yet is the sheath. It will probably not look like this. This is a prototype sheath. Not really what I was going for. I think what I was probably going to end up having is basically a taco sheath, something relatively small. Kydex folded over, grommets along one side, and then something like this, ulti-clip, where depending on how you're going to use it, to be honest, lots of times if I'm out in the woods, as far as fixed blades go, they'll go inside a pack. I don't need immediate access to them. But the sheath is going to be made in a way that it will actually lend itself to being carried kind of somewhere around center line on your waistline, inside your belt, inside your waistband. And to that end, whether you're going to draw it out with your strong hand or reverse grip from your other strong hand, it'll lend itself to both those. And with sheath folded over, it'll be relatively small. It'll be, well, just overall a smaller footprint with respect to the sheath. One thing I haven't mentioned up to this point is set in each side of these micarta scales is pretty sweet badger head pin. What is this knife even called? Honestly, I don't know. A couple names I've been kicking around has been the woodsman's shank or the Back Country Shiv, kind of speaking to both sides of those spectrums and what I was trying to accomplish with this knife. Can you pick one up? Maybe. Here's the rub. These knives are, in my opinion, they're awesome. I think this thing is amazing. With that, Chad does some amazing work. He's a custom knife maker, but he's a custom knife maker. So with that, his capacity for making things in volume is relatively small. More than likely, there'll probably be about 5 of these available a year. Unfortunately, that's pretty much where it's at. But if you are interested, you can hopefully pick up one of these 5 that will be available each year. Price-wise, it's going to be about $275. Is that a lot of money? I don't think so. Not for what this is. You're like, ah, man, that is a lot of money. You know what? If it is, what should you do? You should go down and buy a $10 Mora. You will be so happy with it. It will probably do most of the things this will do. Will it be as comfortable? No. Will it have a tapered tang? No. Will it have a unique blade design for the reasons that I spoke to earlier? Absolutely not. And it won't have that sweet badger head pin, but it'll be a functional knife for you. If you are interested in these knives, like I said, probably about 5 available a year. Overall, I'm actually really stoked on this knife, and yeah, I'm really excited the way this project turned out. Where can you go to pick up one of these knives? There will be a link down below. If you go there and they're sold out, I apologize. So where do you go after that? A couple places. One, over at kitbadger.com, if you scroll to the bottom of the main page, you can sign up for email list. Usually about once a week, I'll put out an email and I'll say, hey, this is what's going on, this is what's coming up, this is maybe what just happened, and usually in there, there'll be a link to an unlisted video you're going to see before it gets released. And occasionally special videos that, honestly, I just share with the people on that email list. This will be one of those things where when there's a new batch coming up, whether it's pre-order or not, links will initially probably go out there. Beyond that, I would suggest either both myself as well as CK Knife and Tool, Instagram. We usually put stuff, whether it comes up in the stories or a post, if and when end up doing another run of these. Those are probably your best bet though with respect to picking one of these guys up. If you do end up picking one up, I would love to hear your stories about how you use it. I really like and enjoy this knife. It fulfills, pretty much checks all those boxes I was looking for with respect to a knife that I was gonna make. But as always, thank you for joining us at kitbadger.com. Look forward to seeing you next time.